Presenting is Nicola Postol. Nicola is a physiotherapist and a PhD candidate working on a world-first clinical trial investigating the potential merits of a hands-free exoskeleton in neurorehabilitation. Nicola will now present some of her experiences and findings in this, or using this very, what I think is quite sci-fi and amazing exoskeleton robot. So I'm going to hand over to Nicola.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for having me here today. It's been, my word of the week is spectacular. Having taken my kids to see Aladdin on Saturday, and I think this morning's been spectacular as well. It's been really thrilling to be a part of it. I must acknowledge my supervisors. As Nicola mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Newcastle. My supervisors, Jodie Marquez, Neil Spratton, Andrew Brivard, are obviously part of this team. I'd also like to thank Jeanette Lechner-Scott and Amanda Lydon for their help recruiting some of you to participate in my research and for their support of what it is that we're doing. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background of robotics in neurorehab, specifically robotic exoskeletons, tell you a bit about exactly what it is that I'm doing, and just some really, preliminary findings from the research that we're doing. It's still very much ongoing. And so, they're more snippets of information rather than hard and fast analysis of results at the moment, but that's coming next year. So you might be wondering what a robotic exoskeleton actually is. The word robot actually comes from Eastern European languages where the word robota means slave or work or labour, drudgery. My Polish mother-in-law uses the word roboty when she's going to go and do her housework. Karel Čapek is the first person who ever used the word. He's a Czech political satire, I don't know how you say that word, satirist, and playwright, and he wrote a play that was basically about a factory that created artificial human beings, or artificial life forms, more like androids than robots, but quite groundbreaking for 1920. Robotic exoskeletons are machines, basically, and they have what we call actuated joints. So actuated means powered. So exoskeletons can have varying numbers of actuated joints depending on their design, and I'll show you some in a minute. Robotic exoskeletons can be coupled with body weight support, so suspended in a harness so that the harness takes some of your weight. They can be suspended over a treadmill, so paired with a treadmill and used on a treadmill. They can have what we call EMG triggers, so that they're kind of responding to the muscle activity in the person in the robot, and work with the person. Or none of those. They might be separate like Helen is. They offer varying degrees of support depending on their design again, and you'll see that in a moment. So I'm just going to move that because I keep having to lean the other way. And varying clinical applications potentially, which is exactly what we're trying to find out. The research that I'm a part of is, as Nicola kindly said, it's world first. The robotic exoskeleton I'm working with has only had very limited research done on it so far. So we really are sort of trying to test the waters and see where this could take us. So when you hear the word robotic exoskeleton, I don't know what comes into your mind. I know, some of the things that people have said to me over the course of the last 4 years since I've been involved in this whole concept. But you might be thinking about something along those lines. Transformer. You might think it's a bit RoboCop. Or a Dalek. Anyway, especially UK people might think about a Dalek. My personal favourite, Darth Vader. We're a big Star Wars family. And Wallace and Gromit, the wrong trousers, which is probably the closest to what I've got in my lab, rather than any of the others. But bearing the first picture there in mind, the transformer, this is actually where exoskeletons began. So the first exo did look like a transformer. This is actually called the Hardyman. It was made in 1965. And the background to a lot of exoskeletons isn't actually anything to do with healthcare. It's to do with maximising capacity, particularly with things like lifting in industry. So you might have seen in the news there's exoskeletons being used in car manufacturing to give people support to be able to then work underneath the body of a car. They're being used a lot in manufacturing. They're used in the military. Excuse me. But exoskeletons for the purpose of gait assistance began to emerge in the 1960s and 70s. And one that's been extensively researched and around for quite some time now is the Lokomat, which is developed by Hokoma in Switzerland. And this is one which basically is an exoskeleton that's attached to the legs in pairing with the body weight support that I was describing before, so that you're suspended over a treadmill. And what the exoskeleton is actually doing is taking some of the work of the therapists who would be working with that person. So in the past, if you did treadmill training, you may very well, and you still may very well, have a couple of therapists, one on each leg, actually moving your leg for you whilst you're suspended in the body weight support system. What this has done is alleviate some of that strain on therapists. And so similar to in the manufacturing industries, exoskeletons have potential to actually minimise some of the harmful effects of being a physio, where we do actually often take quite a lot of a person's weight or crawl around on the floor to try and assist somebody with their movement. So that's part of the reason for their development as well. Why do we need exoskeletons? You may be wondering. And, very much, a lot of people are sort of anti this development of robotics, partly because it may take jobs away. What an exoskeleton might offer and why it excites me is because, having been a clinical physiotherapist for 20 years, well, not quite 19, we'll round it up, I have worked with people with neurological problems my whole career. They're my passion. I absolutely love working with you guys. But what is frustrating and really hard for us as therapists is to achieve maximum outcomes, really good outcomes with people who have severe mobility impairments. So my research isn't only working with people with MS. I'm actually working with people who've had a stroke or have spinal cord injury as well. And for a lot of those people, severe mobility impairment actually adds to the problem of actually trying to access therapy. So as I said before, if you're a person who needs assistance to get into standing, you may very well have multiple therapists working with you to achieve that. So, in the past, great equipment like, walking hoists that we have access to these days, and they're on a lot of rehab wards now, it's still not unusual for there to be 4 therapists helping a person to stand and try and walk for the first time. I've been involved in that many, many times. So it's a real problem having access to 4 therapists to get somebody moving in a good way. So the point of the exoskeleton is to try and hopefully alleviate some of that strain on therapists, actually improve the movement that you're giving somebody, because while it's really tricky to move somebody, you're also probably not getting a great movement pattern as well. So it's helping to alleviate some of those problems. And so hopefully overcoming this issue with the limited access to quantity and intensity of treatment that's needed when you have a neurological problem. We know very well now that with the way that the brain works and the central nervous system works, that we need to practice things a lot to get them to be cemented. However, that's one of the reasons for the treadmill paired robotics like the Lokomat. But one of the issues with those types of devices, as Luke hinted on before, is that you can do that, but then can you do it off the treadmill? So you're learning how to move in one way with one thing to look at, whereas the exoskeletons that can be used over ground, so my exoskeleton works over ground, not over a treadmill, you've got the capacity to move around in your space. So you have different inputs to your vision and different stimuli. You can potentially work in different environments and therefore, and move in different directions as well. And not just focusing on gait either, because another drawback of those treadmill type exoskeletons is that really their focus is on walking. And for someone with severe mobility impairment, walking might not actually be A, something that's your main priority, or B, something that's actually likely to be possible. So we're actually looking very much at trying to get people functionally more able at home. So not necessarily to improve walking, but can you actually improve your transfers in and out of your wheelchair and things like that. So looking very much at those people that often miss out on research, because a lot of research focuses on people who can already walk. There are lots and lots of exoskeletons out there. There are even more exoskeletons for the upper limb. There are absolutely loads of them. So it's hard to actually get some concrete idea about what's out there, what's going to work for what, because there's so many of them. And also because they're fairly new, there isn't a concrete answer to any of those questions. So the exoskeleton that I work with is known affectionately as Helen. Many of you have met her, some of you have met Helen, and some of you know her quite intimately. Helen is the hunter's exoskeleton for lower limb exercise and neurorehabilitation, as to why I call her Helen. It's much less of a mouthful. So I'm just going to show you a video here. I think do I press it again? I don't. What do I do? Tom? There we go. This video is just a little taster of what Helen looks like and how she moves. That beautiful video was made by Mark Rothschild, who's the communications manager at HMRI, starring my intern from a couple of years ago from the US, Carly Gehrig. That was actually made with the stroke population as an audience, but that was because at the time we were still going through the ethics approval process for opening our trial up to people with MS. But it gives you an idea of how Helen moves and what she may be able to do for people. So the Rex Bionics exoskeleton, Helen is a Rex Bionics exo. That's what she looks like. As I said before, kind of like the wrong trousers. I don't think I look too much like Wallace or Gromit, hopefully. So Helen was manufactured by Rex Bionics, which is a New Zealand-based company, which I think is wonderful that it's not Chinese or US, it's very local. Helen is owned by the Australian Institute of Neurorehabilitation. They are a not-for-profit organisation started a few years ago with the basic aim of trying to improve community access to physiotherapy. And they wanted their point of difference to be technology. Oh, sorry. Skipped a bit there, got a bit overexcited. I can't go back. Thank you. So Helen is different to many exoskeletons in that she is what we call freestanding. So in fact, she's different to all the other exoskeletons. Every other exoskeleton that's been designed so far requires the user to actually support their weight still with a pair of crutches or a walking frame or sticks or something. Whereas Helen actually is freestanding, so she'll stand up and support all of your weight, therefore hopefully maximising the capacity for people with severe mobility impairment. It doesn't matter if you have affected upper limbs, you can still use Helen. She's also powered at the hip, knee and ankle in both legs, which again is not that common. Most other exoskeletons are only powered at the hip and knee. And so just manufacturing limitations, she'll only fit people, well, I say only, that's quite a big range, people between those height and weight limits. And in terms of research, really very limited so far. The only published trial with this device in the whole world so far was published a couple of years ago and was simply looking at whether people could or couldn't transfer into the device, people who had spinal cord injury. And whether they could complete one session of exercise in that device. So it wasn't anything to do with patient outcomes, whether they were going to improve in any way, shape or form. It was more about accessibility and feasibility. So really what we're doing is very different to that. When, as part of my PhD, we did a systematic review, which basically looks at all the available literature so far. We did actually focus that on people with stroke, because at the time there was more available literature. And what we found was that robotic therapy, so obviously the Rex Bionics device wasn't included in this because that study doesn't have outcomes as such. But the included studies showed that robotic therapy does improve outcomes. However, when you compare robotic therapy with conventional therapy, it's not consistently showing that there's more benefit using a robot than there is using conventional therapy. And in fact, for the Berg Balance Scale, the overall outcome was better with conventional therapy. So some interesting outcomes there. We very much found that the literature so far has focused on walking ability and those types of outcomes and balance, not so much about global function, bladder and bowel function, you know, all those other sorts of things that that we need to consider as part of the, you know, the whole person. Mood, quality of life and the acceptability of robotic therapy have hardly been researched in any of the literature so far either, so significant things missing. And basically the long and short of our review was that we suggested that people with severe mobility impairment should be the focus of research with exoskeletons, because we feel that it's those people who are probably going to benefit the most. And a lot of the research that's been done so far has included a lot of people who are already ambulant. So you sort of think, well, if you can walk, we should be walking you in probably different settings. In terms of MS specifically, one device called the ReWalk has been shown to have potential in people with MS if they have severe mobility impairment. So they've gone down the same track that we're sort of heading down as well. Another device called the Kyogo showed improvement in stairs and walking ability after just using it for 2 weeks at home in people who can ambulate independently already. So there is potential for improvement, but we sort of expect that there's probably more room for improvement with people with severe mobility impairment with these devices. And as I say, there's no published sort of study with the Rex exoskeletons so far that has looked at patient outcomes over a period of time. So basically, we're looking to try and establish how easy it is to use the Rex Bionics exoskeleton with people who have had a stroke, have MS, or have a spinal cord injury. Are there any functional or quality of life outcomes that can be positively affected with this device in these neurological populations? And then, depending on the outcome of both those questions, what do we do next? So we have three Helen trials going. We have the trial with people with acquired brain injury, the MS trial and the spinal cord injury trial. They are all designed in exactly the same way so that we will actually be able to put all the data together and also compare the conditions as well. So that will be really interesting once we get to do that. They all start with what we call a 12-week observation phase. So what that's looking at is what you are like from the beginning of the 12 weeks to the end of the 12 weeks, doing what you normally do. Does your strength, balance, movement and all that sort of thing change with what we call usual care? And then we do 12 weeks of intervention with the robot. So coming to see me at the university twice a week for up to half an hour each time in the robot for 12 weeks. And again, looking at your changes over that time. And then unlike a lot of neurological rehab research, we are doing a 12-week follow-up to try and establish whether if there was any gain made, did you keep that gain? Or did you, was it detrimental? So we're interested in what happens after, because you should expect probably change during the time, but do you keep it? The inclusion criteria for our trial are, the main one is about severe mobility impairment. So for each condition, it's determined by a specific scale to that condition. The EDSS is the one that we're using for people with MS. But what that basically looks like is somebody who either is primarily in a wheelchair or someone who's using a walking aid or the assistance of a person to be able to mobilise. Their diagnosis must have been at least 3 months ago, and that's to try and establish that someone has probably, certainly with things like with stroke, that their spontaneous recovery has passed, but also that that you're stable, you've possibly started medications, all those sorts of things have all happened. They must be a resident of the Hunter region, and that's partly because of the funding for the device, which partly came from the Newcastle Permanent Charitable Foundation. So it was determined that it must be Hunter residents that were receiving this. People must be adults. That's mainly because they probably won't fit the device otherwise, because it's obviously aimed for adults. They must have been discharged from inpatient rehab. I guess it's probably obvious why, but if you haven't been discharged from inpatient rehab, you're still having a lot of probably what you call intensive rehab, where we're looking for people who've passed that phase and are much more, managing themselves at home. In terms of what stops you from participating, as I said, the manufacturer specifications in terms of weight and height. Being pregnant is a no-no because of where the straps go. Any unstable or severe cardiac or respiratory compromise, or really anything that affects your ability to exercise in an upright position, is a contraindication or an exclusion criteria. If you've recently fractured your leg, so I can't use Helen because I broke my leg this year, and inadequate cognition. So, as part of the ethics process, we need to ensure that people understand what they're signing up for and they can process the information, and more importantly, tell me if they're not happy. The things that we're looking at are physical outcomes. So we're looking at how you move and your function based on scales depending on your condition, how strong your quads are, and also we look at grip strength as well. What your balance is like, your endurance, whether your spasticity changes. So one of those hidden symptoms of MS, does that change at all? Your fitness, we're looking at whether your fitness changes from the beginning of using Helen to the end of using Helen. And we're also looking at whether your body composition changes, so what your body is made up of. And the reason for that was actually, we spoke about this with Jeanette very early on when we were looking at working with people with MS, and felt that one of the biggest things that's tricky to manage when you're primarily in a wheelchair is your weight, and wondering whether access to being in an upright position for 12 weeks more than you would normally makes any difference to what your body is made of. We're also looking, importantly, we think, at quality of life. We know very well from the research that quality of life is hugely affected by neurological conditions. And so we're looking at using standardised scales to assess whether your mood changes. Again, fatigue, another hidden symptom of MS. It's hugely problematic. Does that change over the time that you're using Helen? Your quality of life in terms of how that relates to your health, does that change? Your level of independence, or you can flip that on its head and say dependence, does that change over the time that you're using Helen? And also, importantly, we want to know what people think about it, because, working with a robotic exoskeleton versus going to a physio clinic and doing a bunch of exercises in some parallel bars is quite a different kettle of fish. What we're actually doing is working. So I don't know if it's hard to kind of see from looking at this picture. This is Bill, one of my wonderful stroke participants, who did give his permission for the photo to be used. Having some exercise in Helen. We look at things like postural correction, shifting your weight from side to side, so trying to maximise your use of both sides of your body. Repetitive function, so thinking about how we know that to cement pathways in your nervous system, we need to practice things a lot. So Helen gives us that capacity in a much easier way than in a clinic with 4 physios. So practicing things like sit to stand and walking. Strength exercises such as squats, And where possible, I try and get people exercising their upper limbs as well, to try and maintain or improve range of motion, strengthen their upper limbs, but also to engage their core, because being able to stand in a fully upright position enables you to access those things that are a bit more tricky when you're depending on leaning on a frame or worrying about how you're transferring. Helen gives you the capacity to stand and wave your arms around and feel a bit freer. So it's good to engage your trunk in those sessions too. In terms of what we found, like I said, you have to bear in mind these are really preliminary findings. I am still recruiting, this is my sales pitch now, I'm still recruiting for another month. If anyone is interested in being part of the study, like I said, the main thing that you need to have is what we're calling severe mobility impairment. If you're interested at all, come and speak to me today, or tell someone to come and get me to speak to you, and I'll grab your phone number or email so I can send you more information. But what we have found so far is it certainly appears to be safe to exercise in Helen, which is obviously a number one concern. People are actively exercising when they're in Helen. So a big criticism of exoskeletons is that they do all the work for you. The wonderful people I've had coming and using Helen have very much said that they feel like they can do things they don't normally have the ability to do. They feel like they can help move, despite the fact that Helen actually doesn't have that built-in EMG feedback. So Helen doesn't actually react to how you move. Helen will move regardless, but people still feel they can help. And we've shown that with some of the research we've done looking at whether your metabolic requirements change when you're in Helen and depending on which exercise you're doing. So we showed that you are actually exercising. So that's a real positive, particularly when we're thinking, we're putting people through something that's quite hard to get into, quite hard to sort of commit to when you've got severe mobility impairment. Is it actually doing anything? Well, it seems to be. Exercise in Helen can certainly increase the potential standing time for exercise when you compare that with traditional therapy. I'm thinking in that half an hour session, you can stand for the entire half an hour, because even if you feel a bit fatigued, you can just rely slightly more on Helen. Of course, if the participant wanted to sit down, I would certainly sit them down. But it seems to be enabling people to have a lot more time on their feet. And we know very well that regardless of your condition, standing and being upright and weight bearing is extremely important. So even if your actual your impairments from your MS don't change, are we going to be able to maybe change some of those secondary complications from just not being able to stand? So we're not looking at bone density in this trial, but those sorts of things are considerations. Your bladder and bowel function, other things that can be positively affected by being able to be upright, that aren't anything to do with how strong your legs are or whether you can walk. Confidence with mobility and transfers in outside of using Helen. If your confidence and capacity to transfer at home improves whilst you're using Helen, that can be really important to some people. And I certainly had that verbal feedback from a couple of my participants with MS. It doesn't seem that Helen adversely affects spasticity. It also doesn't seem, like I say, these are preliminary findings, doesn't seem to positively impact it either. It doesn't seem to really make much difference. But the good thing about that is, it's not making it worse. And obviously we're always, worrying about things that might make things like that worse. It's certainly possible to engage in upper limb work and activate trunk muscles while standing in Helen. And exercising in Helen certainly seems to be acceptable when you're sort of thinking about the alternatives being traditional therapy. People seem to be really quite happy and positive about using an exoskeleton. I must hugely thank the people, I'll get to Yoda in a second, the people who volunteered to participate in our research. As Jane Gray mentioned early on in the day, you guys are absolutely incredible. You're literally putting your faith in something that you've got no idea if it's going to work. I have no idea until I analyse those results. But it means the world to us that you're prepared to commit to such a lot of time coming to the university to put up with me and Helen. And as Yoda would say, I still have a lot to learn, both in life, but generally in the PhD, there's a lot that we need to find out still. And if anyone's interested, there's references as well. Does anyone have any questions? I think I maybe have 1 minute or two. No.